I've been trying to piece together how I first became aware of the idea of early Christian Gnosticism, but I have to admit that the timeline gets blurry. At the moment, my best guess is that I think it might have been around 2002 in a copy of The Big Issue, a magazine sold by homeless people around London. This particular issue had an article about Philip K. Dick, the celebrated author of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, A Scanner Darkly, and of The Man in the High Castle, among others. It's not impossible that this article was advertising the upcoming release of the film Minority Reports, based on one of his short stories. As I was reading the article, I recognized the earlier films he was being credited with, Blade Runner, Total Recall, of course. But then the article hinted at something very interesting. In 1974, the article said, Philip K. Dick was recovering from a wisdom tooth extraction, and a nurse came a few days later to deliver some medication for the pain. She was wearing a golden pendant in the shape of an ichthus fish, a symbol he'd apparently never seen before. Intrigued, he asked what it was, and she explained that it was an early Christian symbol. What happened next is what caught my attention. He described the world around him shifting to reveal that both he and the nurse were in fact early Christians, themselves living in fear of detection by the Romans who had trapped the world in an iron cage, an experience he defined as an anamnesis, the loss of forgetfulness. With forgetfulness here being forgetting that they were really early Christian fugitives, a state that had been overlaid with the illusion of being a science fiction author of the mid-1970s. But that wasn't the end of what happened. Once the nurse left, he was hit with what he described as a beam of strange pink light, which downloaded a ton of weird information into his brain, which he then spent most of the rest of his life trying to unpack. The information was very varied, but it included the information that his son was currently suffering from an undiagnosed hernia, which would kill him in a matter of weeks if it went untreated. A precautionary trip to the doctors later, in fact, confirmed this message, and his child's life was saved. But he could no longer dismiss this experience as a mere hallucination. You can find out more about that incredible situation by reading his semi-autobiographical book VALIS. But from my own perspective at the time of reading the article, well, if you've seen some of my very early videos, you might remember that around this time I'd already become fascinated by the systematic misrepresentation of the teachings attributed to Jesus at the hands of the various so-called Christian churches, the very institutions who claimed to be upholding and promoting them. And for a couple of years, I was just filled with this all-pervading, permanent state of absolute outrage at how effectively and definitively these institutions had managed to suppress those teachings and even promote their opposite. And nobody was challenging this. And so I was hungry for any indication that there might be someone out there, anyone who understood how the Roman Empire had usurped the original transformative, liberating Christian mysteries and essentially neutralized them by appropriating their signs and symbols, and just slightly modifying the narrative, shifting the emphasis here and there, suppressing certain writings, to finally arrive at some kind of corrupted upside-down version designed to enslave for ease of governing rather than to liberate for the good of mankind. So this hopefully gives you an idea of how ready I was to find out about Philip K. Dick's experience when I read the article. The article recommended VALIS as further reading on the topic, and I obviously bought the book at the first opportunity, and I think that that's probably where I read about the Nag Hammadi library for the first time, and was exposed to the concept of Gnosis. Unfortunately, that word's been abused quite a bit in recent decades, not least by Peter Carroll, who used it in Liber Null to signify an altered state of mind propitious to the performance of magic. I'm actually very grateful to Jason Louv, who called out this mistake in one of his podcasts, pointing out that the correct word for this should be ecstasis, not gnosis. No, gnosis literally means knowledge. It's not a state of mind, it's something that a mind can contain. And in this context, it's something that can change a mind from within. Philip K. Dick defined it as live information, an actual entity that lives in human minds. And he believed that this particular gnosis had been preserved in a dormant state on the pages of the Nag Hammadi library until the texts were discovered and read in 1945, at which point this mind dweller and modifier had sprung back into action and was now spreading once again. It sounds pretty sinister maybe, but at the time I was fascinated. So a year later, in 2003, when the sequel of the Matrix movie was announced with a huge online advertising campaign that included philosophical essays on Gnosticism, I absorbed those as though they were life itself. And one of the articles had a link to the newly available Nag Hammadi library texts themselves. Let me tell you a little bit about the Nag Hammadi library, just in case you're new to the topic. It's a crazy story. In 1945, a young farmer in the city of Nag Hammadi in northern Egypt was digging by a graveyard for fossilized manure, for fuel, when his shovel hit upon something hard, a sealed jar which he originally feared might contain a jinn spirit, but after consideration realized might contain treasure. When he cracked the jar open, he found a great number of scrolls, codices, which he immediately recognized might be of some value. So he took them home before setting back out for work. When he returned home, he actually realized that his mother had used one of the codices to kindle a fire, while the rest was sold and little by little disappeared onto the black market. They were then, one at a time, gathered back together by a Cypriot antiques dealer in Cairo, all except for one, the very first codex in the collection, which, through a series of synchronistic circumstances, ended up being gifted to none other than Carl Jung, which Jung committed to translation in 1961. A few years after Jung's death, the so-called Jung Codex was returned to the Cairo Museum, and it's not until 1971 that the first translation became fully available in English. And it's in 1981 that the text became available in an affordable paperback edition, with a fully revised edition appearing in 1988. So in the grand scheme of things, this is all quite recent. Now, what's useful to note here is that just in the same way as the Bible is a collection of short books by different people with different agendas and even different understandings and takes on the core premise, so too are the codices of the so-called Nag Hammadi library. The collection contains texts that have been identified as representing four main separate philosophies that are only partially related. Sethian Gnosticism, so descending from Adam and Eve's son Seth. Valentinian Gnosticism, which follows Valentinius's 2nd century heretical theology, not to be confused with Saint Valentine of the 3rd century, the unwitting source of heart-shaped balloons, teddy bears, and overpriced cards. Then we have Thomasine Christianity, a version of Christianity that focused on the meanings of the hidden sayings that Jesus spoke to his twin brother Judas Thomas. Thomas means twin, by the way. It's a descriptive epithet. The name of Jesus' twin brother was Judas. Again, not to be confused with Judas Iscariot, the betrayer. However, this is the same Thomas who is famously mocked in John in the 4th canonical gospel for not believing until he can place his fingers in Jesus' wounds, a thinly veiled dig at doctrine that focuses on direct experience of God and salvation through knowledge. Finally, we have a few texts in Codex 6 from the Hermetica that can be classified under the doctrine of Hermeticism, following the teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a syncretic Greco-Egyptian divine figure combining Hermes and Thoth, going back as far as the 2nd or 3rd century BCE. Some writings of Plato were also included in the Nag Hammadi library, but I guess I might address that in a later video. Now, I'm hoping that this woefully short introduction will be enough to fill you in on the key points if this is a new topic for you. I definitely recommend checking out at least the Wikipedia page linked in the description if you're still curious to dig deeper. Okay, so now we get to the core, deeply unsettling premise at the center of this video. What could be so blasphemous, so deeply heretical that these texts would be forbidden, and in fact might inspire so much hatred and fear that they might have to be kept in a sealed jar underground? Well, you know the traditional account of the beginning of all things that you can read in Genesis, the first book of the Torah, the first book of the Bible. Over 7 days, well, 6 actually, God creates the world and adds all the necessary features for a livable environment before creating mankind in God's own image as a crowning achievement. Well, hold on to your seats. The story in the Gnostic scriptures is that God doesn't create the world. Through a series of self-reflective processes, God creates other perfect spirits, indeed aspects of God, though distinct from God, and those aspects in turn go on to create more distinctions, more spirits, so to speak, all in accordance with the powers that precede them. So in other words, with the accord of the original primary source. And this goes on until one of the spirits, Sophia, desires a progeny of her own and creates a spirit without the consent of the rest of the heavenly host. The spirit is born blind and deaf, or whatever these metaphors might mean for a spirit, of course, and ignorant. But it has power since it descends from the original source. Sophia panics and sends her son away into a cloud to conceal it from the others, but to no avail. The son, who can't realize his true situation, creates a world, a material, grotesque world over which to rule. And he creates material, physical beings that crawl and writhe in pain upon the surface of his creation. Now his mother, Sophia, sees what her son has done and decides to hand herself into the authorities, so to speak, and asks for permission to go in and save these poor creatures that her son has created. And so she goes in and plants in the humans seeds of divinity from the source that can grow, so that the children are now infused with divinity from the original source, can now eventually escape from the torture of life on earth. The blind god is called Yaldabaoth, the demiurgos, the demiurge, which translates as the creator. And the main difference between the Valentinian school and the Sethian school is that the Sethians saw Yaldabaoth as a willfully evil creator, whereas the Valentinians saw him as merely imperfect and acting out of ignorance. But either way, the upshot is that anyone taking these texts at face value will understand Jesus' teachings to be tools designed to help escape the material world and return to the pleroma. The words of the Christ are the Gnosis. Sophia is the Greek word for thought, and the Greek word Gnosis translates as knowledge, specifically divine knowledge that saves. The kind of knowledge channeled through a Promethean figure bringing fire to humanity in spite of the gods. So for anyone who's watched my previous video on Satan and Lucifer and the end thoughts that I left you with there, I'm hoping that little by little we can circle ever closer to a deeper understanding of what might be considered an esoteric understanding of Christianity. But as I later discovered, this still isn't the full story, and I'd really like to make a third and final video in this series to explore the pitfalls of a purely Sethian, Gnostic approach to life, which I experienced for a good few years, and to propose a middle way that honors the cosmology and acknowledges our human condition, but that results in constructive outlooks and resolutions rather than the kind of defeatist, paranoid panic that people often default to when they embrace these new Gnostic ideas, this new cosmology. But as I say, we can talk all about that next time. For now, let me just say that anyone wishing to talk about these kinds of topics in more depth are cordially invited to the Foolish Fish Discord server. Just maybe a little disclaimer there that there is a small paywall as it's only reserved for Foolish Fish YouTube and Patreon members. There are details in the description down there on how to join the Discord once you're all signed up. Memberships start at just $2 a month. And I also do one-to-one video consultations if you want my direct, personal, undivided attention for half an hour or an hour. And you can find the link to see some of the other services I offer, like tarot readings as well, down in the description below or in the pinned comment. A huge thank you to every single existing member out there. Your contributions continue to keep me and my family fed, and the channel well supplied with all the cool books that I review every week. I can never tell you enough how deeply I appreciate your generosity, particularly in these increasingly tough times. It means a great deal. And while I'm thanking members, let me say a special thank you to David Venturini, Caitlin Kopok, Linda Hendricks, and Amun for your incredibly generous support at the Lux Eterna Infinity level, and to all the level 3 Magister Venerabilis members scrolling up on the left there. Do hit that like button if you haven't done so already, and of course subscribe and hit the bell button if you want YouTube to continue letting you know when my next video comes out. So finally, let me thank you for watching this video. Take care of yourselves and of each other, and see you soon with another video.